Thank you so much for inviting me to Istanbul. Such a high energy and fast city, and I'm excited. I always wanted to visit, and I had to move from Berlin to California to finally come to Istanbul. And within all this energy here, the energy at the startup conference here is even more impressive. And I see some of my clients on the list of sponsors here that I remember when they had 20 or 30 employees. And they recognized in Silicon Valley, where I live now, that data is incredibly valuable and at the core of the future. 25 years ago, that was already their mantra. Now we're seeing connected devices, cars generate these huge amounts of data that we need to train artificial intelligence, machines, for precision medicine, and for many other applications. And we have lots of legitimate, important reasons to do so. We want to do maintenance. We want to do maintenance on cars and on humans. We need it for compliance within the companies. We need it for city planning. We need smart cities. And we need it also for law enforcement. And that raises, of course, a number of privacy concerns. And I want to give a few thoughts to you and hear from you all. I hope we can stay connected after this talk on what is data really, and where is this thing with privacy, data protection law going, and what is it going to mean for all of your companies. And I'm very grateful to my partners here in the Istanbul office with whom I worked for a long time on these kinds of projects that I can speak here to you. Now, data itself is information. It exists in our brains. It is stored physically there, but it's also an abstract thing, this information, that nobody can own. Thoughts are free. They have to be shared with others, and we have to use them. We can write them down in books. We can see them on servers. And most of the data that interests us relates somehow to humans and becomes defined and regulated as personal data under data protection laws. Now, data protection laws in Europe were intended to protect privacy, among other things, but privacy is yet another thing. Privacy is this sphere amongst us of autonomy where the government leaves us alone, where other people leave us alone, and we have privacy most effectively in solitude. This is also what the Americans viewed in privacy. They thought about privacy as protection against the government. Very specifically, the founders of the American Constitution were thinking in the 18th century that they need to be protected from British tax inspectors coming to their homes and taking information on how much earnings they had and taking papers away from them. And therefore, they defined privacy to be secure in persons, houses, paper, and effects. When you have a big plantation and there's a river before it and a forest and a house, and you have absolute privacy there, and that's what the American system of privacy protects from. When you live in a marketplace, when you go to the Grand Bazaar or the Spice Bazaar or anywhere in Istanbul outside, the Americans think you are interacting with other people and you don't need privacy. And that's how we've been living on the internet, on social media and other places. We share information about ourselves, we share photos, location, where we are, our thoughts, everything is out there. And so from the US perspective, that's like living in a big marketplace and not in a private home area. And we need in the public, the police, to protect us, protect our privacy, protect our security. And so we need the police also on the internet and in services. That's in a nutshell how the US has been viewing this in the past. Very different from the European view, where privacy doesn't even show up in the general data protection legislation or in the Turkish laws as such. It's all about regulating the processing of personal data. The basic rule is everything is prohibited, and you need to justify why you're doing anything with personal data. That's the environment that companies here in Turkey and in Europe have to live in order to do something with data. Why is that? This is the history, of course, from the German perspective with a real suspicion of what governments can do with data. I'm from a country where our grandparents, when I grew up in Germany, they were living amongst Nazis. They put people to death because of information on their race or religion. And In East Germany, 1/3 of the population was spying on the other 2/3. And so when in my home state of Hessen, about the time when I was born, so I don't take any credit or responsibility for that, when the police was starting to use computers to build profiles to fight terrorists, at the time it was the Red Army fraction, the people of my home state Hessen said, oh my God, here it goes again, fascism is coming back, we need to stop this, and we need to prohibit processing of personal data. The police had just discovered this new thing, these computers and software, and they said we can build these profiles and we know who talks to whom, and we need to stop that. That's why Hessen in 1970 prohibited processing of personal data and started this data protection regulation that was then coming up on the federal level in France, several German states, other European countries, and it became a trade obstacle. Only then the European Economic Area, as it was called, stepped in and said we need to harmonize it. And they said we don't care if we have strong protection or low protection, but we want the same protection everywhere. And that's why this law from the 70s in 1995 became EU-wide law, and that's what the Turkish law is based on today. The US looked at this too, but said we will suffocate innovation, we can't do that. We want software, we want development of new technologies, we need free speech, we need free information, we can't regulate data that much. And so the US said, we're not going to have any general prohibitions, we're not going to have one law, and we're going to react to every specific threat with a specific law. We will not just try and regulate this. We will not have authorities, no filings, no specific limits on international transfers, and that is the US environment still today. We have hundreds of laws, though, now that address very specific problems. Children data, health data, they're all narrowly crafted, and they're being heavily enforced. Companies paid fines. The most recent fine was $5 billion against a company for alleged privacy violations. And as a result, US companies taking privacy legislation very serious, but they don't have to minimize data processing under US law. That worked quite well in the US, and a lot of the companies that are sponsoring here today and that are present here, whose services you are using coming from the US. The US view on privacy has changed, though, also. When the US was attacked, as a result, the US police and secret services were also taking stricter views on data processing. I just have to grab one water here. Do you think I can spare one? That would be great. Thank you so much. And the National Security Agency started to spy on people in a great dimension. This, of course, seemed necessary at the time to find who was attacking America, what do you do, everything was in panic. And so civil liberties were curbed, and we had a whistleblower immediately complain about the situation. The whole world woke up to this immense spying. The allies in Europe, thank you so much, really appreciate it. I should have grabbed one myself. And they were complaining about it, the EU reacted, and a European court stopped sharing with the US under the Safe Harbor program. This is a reality for you all too, that you have to live with these international restrictions on data sharing. Now, commerce and business usually finds a way around. The Safe Harbor program was just renamed the Privacy Shield, probably because of this very successful Marvel TV series about the Shield. I don't know for sure. Then came the General Data Protection Regulation, and it didn't contain a lot of innovation. It's basically the same old prohibition from the 70s. If you find anything new there, it's really doubling down on this prohibitive approach. To me, this looks like riding against windmills. The data is already out there. We won't put the genie back in the bottle. And other countries are taking quite different views on this. China, for example, has told its biggest companies to be market leader in artificial intelligence and use whatever data they can get in order to train the algorithms, to have the machines learn. And If anything, they're using more data for governance, and they developed the social credit system in order to have even more control over the 1.3 billion people living there. And I'm not saying that I'm advocating for the system. I just think, just as a reality, as companies, businesses, you develop new products and services, that is also part of your equation of your business plan, because that is where a lot of innovation will be coming from. Surprising to me, the rest of the world has followed the European model. Even though it hasn't been that successful for the Europeans, they don't really have that much technical innovation. Germany, a country of engineers, has not been leading in data, has not been leading in software, and still a lot of countries are following the European approach. I think also, again, as part of this trade dimension where their countries can get adequacy findings or being whitelisted so long as they pass similar laws, and therefore a lot of countries have European-like laws now. That will not help these countries to be successful in the technologies of the future. You do need massive amounts of data to train algorithms, to install machine learning, and we need that for safety purposes too. We want the self-driving cars to recognize what people look like, and the only way to do that is to show them a lot of humans, a lot of persons, so that they can learn from that. The recommendation of European data protection authorities is to blur the faces, to blur the pixels, but then the cars only recognize people with blurry faces, and if I don't have a blurry face, then I will not be recognized by the cars and will be run over. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but I want to make the point is we need more data in order to drive along safely on the street. And it's not just about the automotive sector, it's also in the health sector. We do need the medicine to understand every patient individually. If we always redact information, aggregate it, de-identify it, we will not learn about new correlations that we didn't know yet about when we did a clinical study. If everything has to be based on a detailed, specific, explicit, informed consent form, then we can't foresee what we need in the future. If we suddenly develop a new correlation idea and say, I need to go back to this data of all the clinical trials, maybe the reason why they had this or that condition or why they got healthy more quickly is because of a food habit or an exercise habit or an environmental factor that I hadn't considered yet, but we can't do that if everything is always de-identified. Going back to the car sector, we will have all these nice privacy rights, and they are important to protect the individual, but we also have to recognize all the legitimate interests that people have in the data that is spun off by the cars. The car owners have slightly different interests than the drivers. Other traffic participants, the manufacturers need to know what is wrong with the cars so that they can improve them. The car dealers should market to us as much as we sometimes complain that marketing is harassing or annoying. It is important for competition, and I'd rather get targeted, customized marketing to me when I'm interested in something than just this ongoing barrage of information that is not helpful to me. I think the insurance companies need to know how safely we drive and what they can do to reward good practices, to manage their risks, because we want the policy premiums to go down. And ultimately, we do need also law enforcement. So all this data is needed by very many people, and this will only increase as the cars are connected. Now, with all this data around, the car manufacturer, who play a very important economic role in many countries, are concerned that their role will be diminished, that the tech companies are making all the money, and they will be just left to make hardware. And they're very concerned. The German government came out with a proposal that we should create a new ownership right in data. And their idea was that the car companies own the data that is spun off by cars. But I think we cannot afford to create exclusion rights in data. We need to share this data. And I think also the agenda to commoditize personal information will be directly in conflict with all the privacy laws. Plus, if they were done on a national level, they would just be a huge obstacle to trade. No one owns data, and no one should own data. Even in California, we have such restrictions now. And as of next year, even Turkish companies have to comply with the California Consumer Privacy Act. It was a law introduced by a ballot initiative, not by our parliament, to restrict sharing of data for money. And applies to every company worldwide. It is subject to huge fines, and it will take effect, and it will make it very difficult to share information between companies or even sharing it with the government. You companies have to plan for this. The very successful data-driven companies that you're looking at with business models from the late 90s who are super successful now, grew out of nothing, they're already pursuing a 2030 agenda. And a lot of existing companies are looking at these older business models and try to catch up. But we have to realize that privacy, data protection, data security, ownership, retention, those are very different agendas, and the world is changing. Data is valuable as an asset to us. It can create huge liabilities if we get it wrong with the regulatory compliance. And it is a trade topic that all businesses have to prepare for. The data volumes will increase with digitization, machine learning, AI, and any country that is suffocating that will be left behind. Any company that misses these opportunities will be left behind, for sure. The data gives market power, and increasingly the competition authorities are demanding that certain sectors, companies have to open up their data, for example, in the banking sector. Australia and a number of other regulators forcing the banks to share certain information so that they don't monopolize it. And the European regulators have taken action against companies based on the assertion that they're locking up all the data. At the same time, the data privacy restrictions make it so much more difficult for companies to share data with others. And if they make mistakes here and try to be open and sharing, they can also incur huge liabilities. So they have to be very thoughtful and plan how exactly they're going to make this sharing possible. And the business models from the early 2000s don't necessarily work anymore, as we see when very large companies get very large fines, and there's a general techlash from the population who's asking, is particularly in California where I live and where the technology sector is such a big economic force and is driving jobs and is driving value for the country. Even in California, even in my home jurisdiction of Silicon Valley, the people are pushing for restriction on the data use, and the companies have to adapt to this and have to plan for that. We will also see the data topic being used in the public and international discussions around trade. There will be more and more negotiations where one country says, I will insist that all my data stays on my territory so I can access it, and another country says, if you want to do business with me, then we have to agree on international data flows. It's no surprise that Japan signed a new privacy law as part of a bilateral deal with the EU, where they signed a trade deal, and they also gave mutual adequacy for both jurisdictions. And I think that will be the future, and I think Turkey as a country has to think about that. To what extent do they really want to follow the GDPR? What benefits are there for trade and for the companies? It is an increasingly complex field that we have to live with and have to navigate through. I publish a little privacy field guide that is intended also for business people, and it comes out in Turkish later this year. If any of you find it interesting, it's a pro bono project for me. I make no money off royalties or so, but I'm always excited when I speak to other markets with my colleagues here locally in our Istanbul office. And if any of you want to reach me or have questions, please do reach out to me. It was a great pleasure to give me your attention here for 20 minutes, a lawyer nonetheless, and I appreciate your attention to that. Thank you very much.